What transforms a despised aircraft into a legend? The Bell P-39 Airacobra entered World War II with a reputation so poisonous that American and British pilots refused to fly it into combat. They called it a death trap, a mechanical nightmare, a flying coffin with wings that would spin you into the ground before the enemy ever got a chance. Yet on the frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front, this same aircraft became the weapon of choice for the highest-scoring Allied fighter aces of the entire war. This is the story of how one Russian pilot, in the span of a single day, shattered every preconception about what the P-39 could do, transforming disgrace into glory and proving that the difference between failure and triumph often lies not in the weapon, but in the hands that wield it. The date was March 1943. The skies over the Kuban bridgehead screamed with the fury of two air forces locked in a battle for supremacy that would determine the fate of the entire southern Soviet front. German Luftwaffe pilots, veterans of campaigns from Poland to France to North Africa, controlled the airspace with an arrogance born of experience and technological superiority. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s had carved the Soviet Air Force to pieces during the opening years of the war, and they saw no reason why that dominance would end now. But they had not yet encountered Aleksandr Pokryshkin, and they had certainly never seen what he could do with an airplane that everyone else had written off as worthless. Before we understand what happened in those 24 hours that changed everything, we must first understand why the P-39 Airacobra carried such a terrible reputation, why it arrived in Soviet hands at all, and what made one man see potential where thousands saw only failure. This is a story about redemption, but not the redemption of a machine. Machines have no honor to lose or regain. This is about the redemption of an idea, that tactical brilliance can overcome technological limitation, that understanding matters more than raw capability, and that the right pilot can make any aircraft lethal. The story of the P-39 and Pokryshkin represents one of the great paradoxes of the Second World War. An aircraft designed and built in America, rejected by American pilots, scorned by British aviators, became the preferred weapon of Soviet aces who would achieve victory totals that exceeded anything their Western allies accomplished. This wasn't luck or propaganda. It was the result of one man's refusal to accept conventional wisdom, his willingness to study an aircraft until he understood it better than its designers, and his ability to develop tactical systems that transformed limitations into advantages. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was born from innovation and died from compromise. When Bell Aircraft Corporation designed the aircraft in the late 1930s, they created something genuinely revolutionary. The engine sat behind the pilot, not in front of him. The propeller connected to that engine through a long drive shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. This unconventional layout offered tremendous advantages: better visibility, superior weight distribution, concentrated armament, including a massive 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, and tricycle landing gear that made ground handling far easier than the tail-dragger fighters of the era. American military planners looked at the P-39 and saw the future. The Army Air Corps ordered it into production with high expectations, but between conception and combat deployment, a series of decisions transformed promise into catastrophe. The most devastating came when the Army removed the turbocharger from the design. Engineers had installed this critical component to maintain engine power at high altitudes, where modern air combat increasingly took place. Without it, the P-39's Allison V-1710 engine gasped for air above 15,000 feet, robbing the aircraft of speed and climb rate precisely when pilots needed them most. The official justification cited weight and complexity concerns, but the practical result was an aircraft optimized for an altitude band that barely existed in European combat. The decision to remove the turbocharger reflected the Army's misunderstanding of how air combat was evolving. In the late 1930s, when the P-39 was designed, most military planners expected fighter combat to occur at medium altitudes, perhaps 10 to 15,000 feet. The turbocharger seemed like unnecessary weight and complexity for that mission profile. But by the time the P-39 entered service in 1941, combat had moved higher. German and British fighters routinely fought at 20,000 feet or above. Japanese fighters in the Pacific operated comfortably at altitudes where the P-39 struggled to maintain speed. The aircraft had been optimized for a war that no longer existed, When the P-39 entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1941, British pilots discovered these limitations immediately. In the high-altitude battles over Europe, German fighters could simply climb above the Airacobra's effective ceiling and dive at will. Attacking from angles the P-39 could neither reach nor escape. The aircraft's unconventional design created additional problems. That long drive shaft connecting engine to propeller introduced mechanical complexity and potential failure points. The center of gravity sat far back, making the aircraft prone to dangerous flat spins if pilots mishandled it during aggressive maneuvering. British squadrons relegated the P-39 to secondary duties and requested different aircraft at the first opportunity. American units followed suit, finding the same problems in the Pacific theater, where Japanese fighters combined altitude capability with superior agility. The flat spin problem proved particularly deadly. When a P-39 entered a spin from certain flight attitudes, the aircraft's unconventional weight distribution caused it to rotate around its center point like a falling leaf. Normal spin recovery techniques didn't work. Pilots who tried standard procedures found themselves in an unrecoverable spin that ended only when the aircraft hit the ground. Several pilots died during training flights before the Army issued strict guidelines about avoiding the flight conditions that could trigger these deadly spins. The warnings only reinforced the aircraft's sinister reputation. The P-39 was failing, and failing publicly. Aviation magazines published scathing reviews. Pilots traded horror stories about the aircraft's handling characteristics. The nickname Flying Coffin spread through air bases on 3 continents. Bell aircraft desperately sought solutions, but the fundamental design limitations remained. The company had created an aircraft optimized for one specific type of combat, low to medium altitude fighting with heavy firepower, in a war that increasingly demanded something completely different. Or so it seemed to Western air forces. Test pilots at Wright Field in Ohio conducted extensive evaluations of the P-39, documenting its deficiencies in official reports that circulated throughout the Army Air Forces. These reports noted the altitude limitations, the spin characteristics, the relatively short range, and the complex mechanical systems that required careful maintenance. The cumulative effect was damning. By late 1942, American commanders viewed the P-39 as suitable only for training or secondary roles. No one wanted to send pilots into combat flying an aircraft that the experts had condemned. Enter the Lend-Lease program, that vast economic and military support system through which America supplied its allies with weapons, vehicles, and aircraft. The Soviet Union needed fighters desperately. German invasion had devastated Soviet industry and destroyed thousands of aircraft in the war's opening months. Moscow would accept almost anything that could fly and fight. Between 1941 and 1945, America shipped nearly 5,000 P-39 Airacobras to the Soviet Union, more than any other Lend-Lease fighter type. Western observers assumed the Soviets took them out of desperation, accepting hand-me-downs that nobody else wanted. They were spectacularly wrong. The journey of these aircraft to Soviet service was itself remarkable. P-39s destined for the Soviet Union traveled by ship to ports in Iran, then flew north through dangerous mountain passes to reach Soviet airfields. Other aircraft made the perilous journey through Alaska and Siberia, traversing thousands of miles of wilderness in all weather conditions. Soviet ferry pilots, many of them women, flew these aircraft across distances that tested both human endurance and mechanical reliability. The fact that the aircraft survived these delivery routes demonstrated a durability that Western critics had underestimated. Soviet pilots discovered what Western aviators had missed. The Eastern Front's combat environment differed fundamentally from the war in the West. Most air battles occurred at low to medium altitudes, precisely where the P-39's performance remained strong. Soviet ground attack missions and battlefield air superiority fights rarely climbed above 12,000 feet. In that envelope, the Airacobra's speed, firepower, and maneuverability made it lethal. That 37mm cannon could destroy any German aircraft with a single hit and proved devastating against ground targets. The concentrated nose armament meant that where the aircraft pointed, the bullets went, unlike wing-mounted guns that required complex harmonization and lost effectiveness at range. The tricycle landing gear simplified operations from the primitive, often muddy airfields that Soviet forces used throughout the war. The robust construction of the P-39 also appealed to Soviet maintenance crews who worked under conditions that would horrify Western technicians. Soviet airfields lacked heated hangars, specialized tools, and comprehensive spare parts inventories. Maintenance happened outdoors in sub-zero temperatures, with improvised equipment. The P-39's relatively simple systems and durable construction meant that Soviet mechanics could keep them flying, despite primitive support infrastructure. The aircraft could absorb battle damage and continue operating, a critical advantage when replacement aircraft arrived slowly, and pilots needed every available fighter. Soviet mechanics developed innovative solutions to maintenance challenges that the aircraft presented. When spare parts weren't available, they fabricated replacements using whatever materials they could find. When specialized tools were absent, they improvised with standard wrenches and hammers. This pragmatic approach to maintenance contrasted sharply with Western practices that relied on comprehensive logistics and technical support. The Soviets made the P-39 work not because it was easy to maintain, but because they had no choice and possessed the ingenuity to overcome obstacles. The Soviet winter posed challenges that the P-39's American designers had never anticipated. Engine oil thickened in extreme cold, making starts difficult. Hydraulic systems became sluggish. Metal components contracted, changing tolerances and creating unexpected mechanical issues. Soviet mechanics learned to preheat engines using portable heaters, to substitute lighter weight oils that remained fluid at low temperatures, and to adjust systems to compensate for cold weather effects. These adaptations required understanding the aircraft at a fundamental level, going beyond what any manual described. But hardware advantages alone don't create legends. The P-39 needed pilots who understood how to maximize its strengths while avoiding its weaknesses, who could develop tactics that turned limitations into advantages, and who possessed the skill to exploit the narrow but deadly performance envelope where the aircraft excelled. Aleksandr Ivanovich Pokryshkin was precisely that pilot, and in March 1943 he was about to prove it in a way that would echo through aviation history. Aleksandr Pokryshkin did not come from the Soviet military aristocracy. Born in 1913 in Novosibirsk, Siberia, he grew up in a working-class family during the chaos of revolution and civil war. His father worked in a factory. His mother struggled to feed their children through years of upheaval and scarcity. Young Pokryshkin discovered aviation through the romantic filter that captivated a generation of Soviet youth. He read everything he could find about aircraft and flight, memorizing technical specifications and studying aerodynamics with an intensity that puzzled his peers. While other boys played, Pokryshkin built model aircraft and dreamed of the sky. The Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s promoted aviation with an almost religious fervor. Flying represented modernity, technological progress, the triumph of Soviet science over capitalist backwardness. Young people across the country joined aviation clubs, built gliders, and dreamed of becoming pilots. Pokryshkin absorbed this culture completely. He didn't just want to fly, he wanted to understand flight at its most fundamental level. He studied physics and mathematics, trying to grasp the principles that kept aircraft aloft and made them maneuverable. But the path from Siberian factory town to fighter cockpit ran through obstacles that would have defeated someone with less determination. The Soviet Air Force of the 1930s drew its officers primarily from the Communist Party elite and families with revolutionary credentials. Pokryshkin had neither. When he applied for flight training, authorities rejected him and assigned him instead to a technical school, training him as an aircraft mechanic. For 3 years, he worked on aircraft engines and airframes, absorbing practical knowledge about how fighters actually functioned, learning the difference between design specifications and operational reality. That mechanical foundation would later inform his tactical innovations in ways that pure pilots, who never touched a wrench, could never replicate. Working as a mechanic taught Pokryshkin lessons that would prove invaluable in combat. He learned which aircraft systems were robust and which were fragile. He discovered how battle damage affected different components and which damage could be repaired quickly versus which required extensive work. He understood fuel consumption rates, engine temperature limits, and the wear patterns that indicated impending mechanical failure. This knowledge let him push his aircraft to its limits while knowing exactly where those limits were, a skill that few pure pilots ever developed. Pokryshkin refused to accept that his story ended there. He attended flight school at night while working as a mechanic during the day, sleeping 4 or 5 hours and studying aerodynamics and tactics during every spare moment. His instructors noted his obsessive attention to detail and his willingness to question accepted wisdom. Where other students memorized official doctrine, Pokryshkin analyzed it, looking for gaps and contradictions. He passed his pilot's examination in 1939 and finally received assignment to a fighter regiment, but he entered that unit as a junior lieutenant, surrounded by men who had been flying for years while he repaired their aircraft. His late start meant he had to work harder than his peers to achieve the same level of proficiency. While other pilots relied on intuition developed through hundreds of flying hours, Pokryshkin approached flight systematically, applying the engineering knowledge he had gained as a mechanic. He calculated optimal climb speeds, figured out the most efficient cruise settings, and determined exactly how much fuel different maneuvers consumed. His fellow pilots sometimes mocked this analytical approach as overly intellectual, but Pokryshkin's performance in the air silenced the critics. The German invasion in June 1941 caught Pokryshkin's unit, like the entire Soviet Air Force, catastrophically unprepared. In the war's opening hours, Luftwaffe strikes destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground. Those that managed to get airborne faced German pilots with years of combat experience, flying technically superior aircraft. The slaughter was immense. Soviet fighter regiments lost entire squadrons in single missions. Pokryshkin survived through a combination of luck, skill, and analytical thinking. After each mission, he filled notebooks with observations about German tactics, about what worked and what failed, about the difference between Soviet doctrine and combat reality. His notebooks became legendary among those who knew him. Other pilots came back from missions with vague impressions of chaos and confusion. Pokryshkin returned with detailed analyses: the altitude where German fighters initiated attacks, the formation patterns they used, the signals that indicated an imminent strike, the escape maneuvers that worked and those that failed. He treated combat as a problem to be solved rather than an ordeal to be endured. This analytical mindset let him identify patterns that others missed and develop countermeasures that saved lives. He noticed patterns that others missed. Soviet fighter tactics in 1941 relied on tight formations that looked impressive during peacetime air shows, but proved suicidal in combat. Pilots flew wingtip to wingtip, so focused on maintaining formation that they couldn't watch for enemies. German fighters attacked from the sun, from below, from angles that Soviet pilots never saw because they were staring at their formation leader. Pokryshkin began experimenting with looser formations, with pairs of aircraft where one pilot attacked while his wingman covered, with altitude tactics that traded the Soviet emphasis on aerobatic maneuvering for energy management and position. His commanders initially resisted these innovations as violations of approved doctrine, but the results spoke for themselves. Pokryshkin's flights suffered fewer losses and achieved more kills than units that stuck to the book. The resistance he faced from superiors was intense and sometimes dangerous. In Stalin's Soviet Union, deviation from approved doctrine could be interpreted as ideological unreliability or even sabotage. Pokryshkin had to prove his innovations worked before he gained permission to continue experimenting. This meant taking enormous personal risks, both in combat and politically. One poor result might have ended not just his tactical experiments, but his career and possibly his freedom. The pressure was immense, but Pokryshkin's confidence in his analysis gave him the courage to persist. The winter of 1941 to 1942 brought Pokryshkin face to face with mortality in ways that forged his tactical philosophy. During one mission, he watched his squadron leader, an experienced pilot he deeply respected, make a fundamental tactical error. The leader had spotted a formation of German bombers and immediately ordered a direct frontal attack, following standard doctrine. The German fighter escort, positioned perfectly above and behind the bombers, dove on the attacking Soviet fighters and massacred them. Pokryshkin survived only because engine trouble had delayed his takeoff, putting him behind the main formation. He arrived just in time to watch 6 of his comrades die in flames, victims not of German superiority, but of Soviet tactical inflexibility. That experience crystallized something in Pokryshkin's mind. Courage wasn't enough. Aggression wasn't enough. Even skill wasn't enough if applied through flawed tactical frameworks. The Soviet Air Force was bleeding its pilots white through adherence to doctrines developed during peacetime exercises against imaginary opponents. Real combat against experienced German pilots required different thinking. Pokryshkin began to understand that the greatest service he could provide wasn't killing Germans personally, but developing tactical systems that allowed average Soviet pilots to survive and succeed against better trained opponents. He started thinking about force multiplication. How could tactical innovations let one skilled pilot improve the effectiveness of an entire squadron? The answer lay in creating systems that were teachable, that didn't require exceptional individual skill, and that provided clear decision rules for pilots to follow under stress. Pokryshkin realized that genius-level tactics that only he could execute were useless. He needed tactics that any competent pilot could learn and apply successfully. During the desperate defensive battles of 1942, Pokryshkin refined his understanding through constant experimentation. He studied captured German tactical manuals that Soviet intelligence provided to frontline units. He interviewed German prisoners who had been fighter pilots, asking detailed questions about Luftwaffe training methods and tactical doctrine. He read everything available about Western air combat theories, from British analyses of the Battle of Britain to American fighter tactics manuals. This theoretical knowledge combined with his practical combat experience to create a hybrid understanding that drew on multiple traditions while remaining grounded in Eastern Front realities. The German manuals revealed sophisticated understanding of energy fighting and mutual support that Soviet doctrine completely lacked. Pokryshkin recognized immediately that these weren't capitalist tricks or fascist deceptions, but sound tactical principles based on aerodynamic realities. He began adapting German concepts to Soviet conditions, creating hybrid tactics that combined the best elements of both approaches. This intellectual flexibility, this willingness to learn from the enemy, set Pokryshkin apart from ideologically rigid commanders who rejected anything that hadn't originated within Soviet institutions. By 1943, Pokryshkin had evolved into something rare in any air force, a tactical innovator who combined theoretical understanding with practical experience. He had studied the German Schwarm formation through direct observation and developed Soviet variants that preserved its advantages while adapting to different aircraft characteristics. He understood energy fighting before that term entered the Soviet tactical vocabulary. Most critically, he recognized that the P-39 Airacobra, which he began flying in early 1943, required completely different tactics than the Soviet-built fighters he had flown previously. The P-39 could not dogfight like a Yak-1 or survive damage like an Il-2 Sturmovik. It demanded precision, precise gunnery to exploit that devastating 37mm cannon, precise energy management to stay within its narrow performance envelope, precise timing to attack from positions where the aircraft's speed and firepower overcame its altitude limitations. Pokryshkin developed what he called vertical maneuver tactics, using altitude advantage and diving attacks to engage German fighters before they could force the P-39 into the turning fights where it struggled. He trained his wingmen obsessively, drilling them on formation discipline and mutual support until they operated as a single organism rather than a collection of individual pilots. Pokryshkin's training methods reflected lessons learned through bitter experience. He insisted that his pilots understand not just what to do, but why they did it. During briefings, he explained the aerodynamic principles underlying tactical maneuvers, discussed German fighter tactics and how to counter them, and encouraged questions that challenged conventional wisdom. Other squadron commanders resented this approach as time-wasting intellectualism that belonged in classrooms, not combat units. But Pokryshkin believed that pilots who understood the reasoning behind tactics could adapt when situations deviated from the plan, while pilots who merely followed memorized procedures would freeze when confronted with unexpected circumstances. He created a classroom environment in a combat squadron, something almost unheard of in the Soviet military. Between missions, pilots gathered for lectures where Pokryshkin explained physics, aerodynamics, and tactical theory. He drew diagrams showing energy states and attack angles. He used model aircraft to demonstrate three-dimensional geometry. Some senior officers viewed this educational approach with suspicion, wondering why a fighter squadron needed so much theory. Pokryshkin argued that educated pilots made better decisions, survived longer, and killed more enemies. The results proved him right. He also emphasized gunnery practice with an intensity unusual in the Soviet Air Force. Many Soviet pilots treated ammunition as unlimited, firing long bursts at extreme ranges and hoping for lucky hits. Pokryshkin drilled his men on fire discipline and shooting geometry. The P-39's 37mm cannon carried only 30 rounds. Wasting ammunition on low-probability shots meant having an empty gun when the perfect opportunity appeared. He taught his pilots to hold fire until they achieved ideal position, then deliver one or two precisely aimed rounds that would destroy the target. This discipline transformed the 37mm cannon from a powerful but inaccurate weapon into a surgical instrument. Pokryshkin set up ground targets and had pilots practice attack runs repeatedly, critiquing their approach angles and firing solutions. He timed how long pilots held the trigger, teaching them to fire in short, controlled bursts rather than long sprays. He analyzed why shots missed, whether due to range estimation errors, deflection calculation mistakes, or jerky aircraft control. This attention to gunnery fundamentals was rare in an air force that often emphasized quantity of fire over quality of aim. Pokryshkin personally tested every aircraft assigned to his squadron, flying each P-39 through a standardized evaluation routine to identify quirks and characteristics. Some aircraft flew slightly nose-heavy, others had engines that ran hotter than average, still others showed tendencies toward specific handling behaviors. He matched aircraft to pilots based on their individual flying styles, creating pairings that maximized effectiveness. This attention to detail extended to equipment maintenance, weapons loading, even the personal equipment that pilots carried. Everything that could provide an advantage, no matter how small, received Pokryshkin's careful consideration. He discovered that individual P-39s, even from the same production batch, had distinct personalities. One aircraft might turn slightly better to the left than the right due to minor asymmetries in construction. Another might have an engine that produced a few extra horsepower at high RPM, yet another might have control surfaces that were particularly crisp and responsive. By understanding these individual characteristics and matching them to pilot preferences, Pokryshkin extracted maximum performance from each aircraft. By March 1943, Pokryshkin commanded a squadron within the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, flying his beloved P-39. He had already achieved ace status, but the Kuban campaign would test everything he had learned and prove whether his tactics could work against the Luftwaffe's best pilots under the most intense combat conditions the Eastern Front had yet produced. The Kuban bridgehead battle represented Germany's last major offensive operation in the southern Soviet Union. After the disaster at Stalingrad, German forces in the Caucasus had retreated to defensive positions along the Kuban River, establishing a bridgehead that protected the approach to the Crimean Peninsula. Both sides recognized the strategic importance of this position. For Germany, it represented the last foothold in a region that contained vital resources and protected the Crimean naval bases that controlled the Black Sea. For the Soviet Union, eliminating the bridgehead would open the way to liberating the Crimea and potentially cutting off German forces in the region. The Luftwaffe committed hundreds of aircraft to the battle, including some of its most experienced pilots and newest aircraft types. The Kuban represented more than just a tactical objective. For Hitler, maintaining the bridgehead was a matter of prestige as much as strategy. Retreating further would acknowledge that Germany had lost the initiative in the East permanently. For Stalin, destroying the bridgehead would demonstrate that Soviet forces could not only defend, but also attack successfully, pushing the Germans back toward their own borders. The psychological dimensions of the battle added intensity to an already desperate struggle. Soviet intelligence indicated that German air attacks would intensify in mid-March, targeting Soviet ground forces and attempting to establish air superiority that would enable German ground operations. Pokryshkin's regiment received orders to contest that superiority at all costs. The morning of March 12, 1943, dawned clear and cold over the frontline positions. Visibility extended for miles. Perfect flying weather, which meant heavy combat was inevitable. Weather forecasters had predicted the clear conditions days in advance, giving both sides time to prepare maximum efforts. German commanders planned coordinated strikes using bombers and fighters in numbers not seen since the opening months of the war. Soviet commanders positioned every available fighter to intercept these strikes. The stage was set for a massive aerial confrontation that would determine air superiority over the entire sector. Pokryshkin took off on the mission's first sortie at dawn, leading a flight of 4 P-39s, tasked with intercepting German bombers attacking Soviet positions. Intelligence had reported formations of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters operating over the sector. The mission profile played directly to the P-39's strengths: intercept at medium altitude, attack bombers with the 37mm cannon, and avoid extended dogfights with the German fighters. But intelligence reports and combat reality rarely aligned perfectly. Pokryshkin's pre-flight briefing emphasized the importance of formation discipline and fire control. He reminded his wingmen that their goal was destroying bombers, not engaging in individual combat with German fighters. Every bomber that reached its target could kill Soviet soldiers on the ground. Every bomber destroyed in the air saved lives below. This mission orientation, focused on results rather than personal glory, characterized Pokryshkin's approach to air combat. Pokryshkin's flight climbed to 8,000 feet, positioning between the Soviet front lines and the expected German approach vector. His eyes constantly scanned the sky, searching for the telltale specks that would reveal enemy aircraft. Radio discipline remained strict. Soviet radio equipment was inferior to German gear, and excessive chatter could give away positions or intentions. Pokryshkin's wingmen maintained their positions in the loose formation he had drilled into them, spread wide enough to cover more sky, but close enough to support each other instantly. The formation spacing Pokryshkin used reflected careful calculation. Too tight, and pilots spent all their attention maintaining position rather than watching for enemies. Too loose, and mutual support became impossible when attacks developed. Pokryshkin had experimented with different spacing distances and found the optimal balance through trial and error. His wingmen trusted these formations because they had proven effective in previous combat. The German formation appeared 15 minutes into the patrol, exactly where intelligence had predicted but larger than reported. Pokryshkin counted 12 Stukas, escorted by at least 8 Bf-109s flying top cover, 2,000 feet above the bombers. The Germans had numbers and altitude advantage. Standard Soviet doctrine from 1941 would have dictated either requesting reinforcements or making a head-on attack, regardless of the odds. Pokryshkin ignored both options. He led his flight in a wide arc that positioned them between the Sun and the German formation, climbing aggressively to reduce the Bf-109's altitude advantage. The P-39's rate of climb suffered above 10,000 feet, but he only needed to reach 9,000 to execute his plan. The patience required for this maneuver went against every instinct that Soviet combat doctrine had tried to instill. Aggression was valued, caution was suspected. But Pokryshkin had learned that patience in positioning translated to devastating efficiency in execution. He watched the German formation maintain its course, oblivious to the threat developing in their blind spot. The Sun sat perfectly positioned, making visual detection nearly impossible, even if German pilots happened to look in the right direction. During the climb and positioning maneuver, Pokryshkin made constant tiny adjustments to maintain the optimal angle relative to the Sun and the German formation. This required exceptional spatial awareness and an ability to think in 3 dimensions while managing his aircraft's energy state. Lesser pilots would have rushed the attack or positioned themselves incorrectly, sacrificing the advantage of surprise. Pokryshkin's discipline and patience created the perfect setup for a devastating strike. The German bomber formation maintained steady course toward its target, Stukas flying in their characteristic stepped formation. Their fighter escort focused attention below and ahead, watching for Soviet fighters attacking from the front lines. They never looked up and behind, where Pokryshkin's flight now positioned itself with the Sun at their backs. He selected his target, the rear Stuka in the formation, the one whose destruction would cause minimum disruption to the German formation discipline and maximum confusion as they tried to understand where the attack originated. Pokryshkin's target selection demonstrated tactical sophistication that went beyond simply shooting at the nearest enemy. By attacking the rear aircraft first, he ensured that the rest of the formation wouldn't see the kill and realize they were under attack. This bought precious seconds during which he could destroy additional bombers before the Germans reacted. Every detail of his approach reflected careful thought about how to maximize effectiveness. Pokryshkin rolled his P-39 into a steep dive, building speed rapidly. The Airacobra accelerated beautifully in a dive, one of its few undisputed strengths. His airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour as he closed the distance to the Stuka. The German rear gunners never saw him coming. At 400 yards, Pokryshkin aligned his gun sight with the Stuka's engine and pressed the trigger. The 37mm cannon roared, its massive recoil shaking the entire aircraft. The first round missed, passing just ahead of the Stuka. Pokryshkin adjusted slightly and fired again. This round struck the Junkers precisely where wing met fuselage. The explosive shell detonated inside the aircraft's fuel tank. The Stuka disintegrated in a ball of orange fire. The violence of the 37mm cannon's impact was shocking even to experienced pilots. Unlike machine gun rounds that required multiple hits to destroy an aircraft, a single 37mm shell could literally tear a bomber apart. German pilots who survived encounters with P-39s reported that the cannon fire sounded like hammer blows against their aircraft's structure, and that a direct hit usually meant instant catastrophic failure of whatever component was struck. Pokryshkin dove through the German formation before the escorts could react, his 3 wingmen following in sequence, each selecting a target and firing before following their leader through and away. Within 15 seconds, 3 Stukas were falling in flames, and the German formation had dissolved into chaos. The Bf-109 escorts reacted exactly as Pokryshkin had anticipated, diving after the Soviet fighters and abandoning their position above the bombers. But Pokryshkin had already leveled out and begun climbing again, using the P-39's excellent acceleration at low altitude to regain energy. The German fighters chased empty sky, while Pokryshkin's flight reformed and positioned for another attack on the now unescorted bombers. The German fighter pilots' reaction demonstrated how Pokryshkin's tactics exploited predictable human responses to unexpected threats. When their bombers came under attack, the escort pilots instinctively dove to intercept the attackers. This was the correct response according to their training and doctrine. But Pokryshkin had anticipated exactly this reaction and positioned his escape route to turn the German fighters' strength into a weakness. By the time they realized the Soviet fighters had escaped, Pokryshkin was already setting up his next attack. The remaining Stukas scattered, their mission abandoned as pilots sought survival rather than target accuracy. Pokryshkin selected another target, a Stuka, attempting to escape toward German lines. A 2-second burst from the 37mm cannon severed the bomber's tail. It spun into the ground, trailing smoke. The entire engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes. 4 German bombers destroyed, the remaining 8 scattered and fleeing, their bombs jettisoned randomly across empty countryside. Not a single Soviet aircraft damaged. Pokryshkin led his flight back to base. The psychological impact on the surviving German crews was profound. They had been flying in what they thought was a secure formation, with adequate fighter protection, heading toward a target they had attacked successfully many times before. Then, without warning, their formation was shattered by an attack that seemed to come from nowhere. The survivors would report this experience to their intelligence officers, and word would spread through German bomber units. Soviet fighter tactics were changing, and the skies were becoming more dangerous. They landed, refueled, rearmed, and took off again 90 minutes later. German commanders, enraged by the morning's failure, had ordered another strike with heavier fighter escort. This time, intelligence reported 20-plus German aircraft inbound. Pokryshkin's regiment scrambled every available fighter. The afternoon engagement developed into a massive furball with Soviet and German aircraft tangling across 50 square miles of sky. In the chaos, Pokryshkin's tactical discipline proved decisive. While other Soviet pilots chased individual targets and allowed themselves to be drawn into one-on-one turning fights, Pokryshkin maintained formation integrity and energy discipline. The afternoon battle tested Pokryshkin's tactical system in ways the morning engagement had not. With more aircraft involved and combat spreading across a larger area, maintaining discipline became harder. Individual pilots saw opportunities and wanted to break formation to pursue them. Pokryshkin had to trust that his training had been effective, that his wingmen would stick to the plan even when it seemed like they were missing chances to score kills. He destroyed 2 Bf-109s in the afternoon engagement using identical tactics: position with altitude and sun advantage, dive to attack, fire one precise burst, and escape before the enemy could respond. German pilots found themselves fighting an opponent who refused to play by the rules they expected. Soviet fighters were supposed to turn and burn, to engage in the close-range aerobatic combat, where Luftwaffe experience and aircraft performance provided advantages. But Pokryshkin wouldn't dogfight. He struck from unexpected angles, destroyed his target, and disappeared before retaliation was possible. It was frustrating, unsporting, and devastatingly effective. During one engagement in the afternoon sortie, a veteran German pilot recognized what Pokryshkin was doing and attempted to counter it. The German fighter deliberately climbed higher than the bombers he was supposed to escort, positioning himself to intercept Soviet attackers using Pokryshkin's diving tactics. It was good thinking, but Pokryshkin saw the trap being set. Instead of attacking the bombers directly, he led his wingmen in a series of climbing spirals that appeared aimless, but gradually positioned them above and behind the German fighter, who thought he held the advantage. When Pokryshkin finally attacked, he came from an angle the German never anticipated, from above and behind when the German was watching below and ahead. The Bf-109 never had a chance. Two 37mm rounds shattered its engine, and it fell trailing smoke and flames. This engagement demonstrated Pokryshkin's ability to think several moves ahead, like a chess grandmaster, visualizing the board positions multiple turns into the future. He recognized the German pilot's counter-tactic, appreciated its sophistication, and developed a counter-counter tactic in real time, while flying his aircraft and managing his energy state. This kind of tactical flexibility separated great fighter pilots from merely good ones. The second afternoon sortie brought Pokryshkin's total for the day to 6 confirmed kills, but the tactical impact extended far beyond those numbers. Other Soviet pilots in the regiment had witnessed his methods and begun implementing similar approaches. The entire unit's effectiveness had increased measurably within a single day of combat. German intelligence officers monitoring radio traffic noted with concern that Soviet fighter tactics were becoming more sophisticated, more coordinated, more dangerous. By day's end on March 12, 1943, Pokryshkin had personally destroyed 6 German aircraft, 4 bombers and 2 fighters. His tactics had enabled his entire flight to claim 12 victories without loss. More importantly, he had demonstrated a replicable system that other Soviet pilots could learn and employ. The P-39 wasn't a flying coffin. In the right hands, using the right tactics in the right environment, it was a precision instrument of aerial warfare. Pokryshkin's success on March 12th catalyzed a transformation in Soviet fighter tactics that extended far beyond one pilot or one aircraft type. Within weeks, Soviet Air Force Command was circulating reports about his methods and requesting that experienced pilots travel to Pokryshkin's unit to observe and learn. The key insights that emerged from those observations challenged fundamental assumptions about air combat that had governed Soviet thinking since the 1930s. The bureaucratic machinery of the Soviet Air Force moved slowly in most matters, but word of Pokryshkin's success spread rapidly through informal channels. Pilots talked to pilots, ground crews shared stories with other units, and intelligence reports documented the dramatic increase in effectiveness. Senior commanders who had resisted tactical innovations now found themselves under pressure to explain why their units weren't achieving similar results. First, Pokryshkin demonstrated that aircraft performance existed within contexts, not absolutes. Western air forces had evaluated the P-39 against criteria that reflected Western front combat conditions: high-altitude interception, bomber escort missions that required extended range and endurance, engagements against the latest German fighters operating at their optimal altitudes. In those scenarios, the P-39 failed comprehensively. But Eastern Front combat emphasized different parameters: low to medium altitude air superiority, support for ground forces operating in close proximity to front lines, engagements where powerful armament could substitute for sustained maneuvering capability. In that environment, the P-39's characteristics aligned perfectly with operational requirements. The lesson extended beyond aircraft evaluation to broader questions about military effectiveness. Pokryshkin proved that understanding your weapon's actual capabilities mattered more than its theoretical specifications. He had studied the P-39 exhaustively, learning its performance envelope through methodical testing. He knew exactly how fast it accelerated at different altitudes, how it handled in various configurations, where its energy state allowed aggressive maneuvering, and where caution was essential. That intimate knowledge let him position the aircraft in situations where its strengths dominated and its weaknesses never mattered. Pokryshkin conducted his own unofficial test program during the winter of 1942-1943, when his unit transitioned from Soviet-built fighters to the P-39. He flew solo missions designed purely to explore the aircraft's characteristics, pushing it to its limits in climbs, dives, turns, and high-speed runs. He discovered that the P-39 could dive faster than any German fighter, without structural failure, giving him an escape option that was always available. He learned that it accelerated exceptionally well between 200 and 300 miles per hour, creating a speed band where he could outrun pursuing enemies or catch fleeing targets. He found that the aircraft's controls remained responsive and effective up to very high speeds, allowing precise maneuvering even in terminal velocity dives. These discoveries came from empirical testing, not from reading technical manuals or trusting manufacturer specifications. Pokryshkin treated the P-39 as a scientific instrument that required calibration and understanding. Other pilots simply strapped in and flew, trusting that the aircraft would perform as advertised. Pokryshkin measured, tested, recorded, and analyzed until he understood the machine as thoroughly as its designers, perhaps more thoroughly since he understood it in combat conditions rather than controlled test environments. One discovery proved particularly valuable. The P-39's aileron response remained crisp and immediate at high speeds, where other fighters became sluggish or unresponsive. This meant that Pokryshkin could make sudden directional changes during high-speed dives, throwing off enemy aim or avoiding defensive fire in ways that pilots of other aircraft couldn't replicate. He incorporated this capability into his diving attack tactics, making small but rapid adjustments during the final attack run that made him nearly impossible to track with defensive guns. He also discovered subtle quirks in how the aircraft handled at different altitudes and speeds. At certain combinations of altitude, airspeed, and power setting, the P-39 exhibited a slight rolling tendency that could catch pilots off guard. Rather than viewing this as a defect, Pokryshkin learned to anticipate and use it, incorporating that natural roll into his attack maneuvers. This kind of intimate familiarity with an aircraft's behavior could only come from hundreds of hours of focused experimentation. Second, Pokryshkin revolutionized Soviet thinking about formation tactics and mutual support. Traditional Soviet fighter doctrine emphasized large formations with rigid hierarchies. Squadron leaders made all tactical decisions, while subordinate pilots followed orders and maintained formation. This approach simplified command and control, but eliminated tactical flexibility. When situations developed unexpectedly, the entire formation had to wait for the leader to assess, decide, and communicate new orders. By the time that cycle completed, opportunities had vanished, or threats had materialized. Pokryshkin implemented what he called the group of threes formation, 3 pairs of fighters, each pair operating semi-independently within an overall tactical plan. The formation leader set the general approach and selected targets, but individual pairs had authority to maneuver as needed to achieve kills or avoid threats. Each pair consisted of a leader and wingman with clearly defined roles. The leader attacked while the wingman protected, watching the leader's blind spots and guarding against counterattacks. This division of responsibilities let attackers focus completely on their targets, while defenders maintained situational awareness for both aircraft. The system required extensive training and absolute trust between pilots. Wingmen had to resist the temptation to seek personal glory by abandoning their defensive role to chase kills. Leaders had to trust that their wingmen would protect them during the vulnerable moments when all attention focused through a gun sight. Pokryshkin drilled his pilots relentlessly on these principles, emphasizing that 5 kills for the pair mattered more than individual scores. His approach ran counter to the cult of the individual ace that dominated both Soviet propaganda and German fighter pilot culture, but the results validated the methodology. Training sessions under Pokryshkin's command became legendary for their intensity and realism. He would divide his squadron and conduct mock combat exercises where one group played German fighters using German tactics. These training fights occurred at realistic altitudes, with realistic speeds and realistic consequences for tactical errors. Pilots who broke formation discipline or abandoned their wingmen faced harsh criticism during debriefings. Pokryshkin maintained detailed records of each pilot's performance, tracking improvement over time and identifying weaknesses that required additional training. He understood that combat skills degraded without constant practice. Even experienced pilots who hadn't flown for a few weeks showed deterioration in their gunnery accuracy and tactical judgment. Pokryshkin instituted a training regimen that continued even during active combat operations. Between missions, pilots practiced formation flying, gunnery runs against ground targets, and simulated combat maneuvers. This constant drilling kept skills sharp and built the muscle memory that pilots needed to execute complex maneuvers without conscious thought during the chaos of actual combat. Pokryshkin also pioneered the use of post-mission debriefings that went beyond simple reporting of results. After each combat sortie, his pilots gathered for detailed analysis of what had happened, what had worked, and what needed improvement. These sessions were frank and sometimes uncomfortable, with junior pilots critiquing senior officers' decisions if the tactical situation warranted it. This openness to criticism and commitment to continuous improvement created a learning organization that got better with each mission. Third, Pokryshkin pioneered what modern aviators would recognize as energy management tactics. Before his innovations became widespread, most Soviet pilots thought about air combat in terms of turning performance and aerobatic capability. A good fighter could outturn opponents performing tighter circles and reversals until achieving a shooting position. This approach worked against poorly trained opponents, but failed against Luftwaffe professionals who understood energy fighting, the art of managing speed and altitude to control engagement geometry. Pokryshkin recognized that the P-39 could not consistently win turning fights against Bf-109s or Fw-190s flown by experienced pilots, but it could excel in vertical maneuvers, trading altitude for speed in dives and using that speed to climb back to advantageous positions. He developed tactical patterns that kept his aircraft operating in the speed ranges where it performed best, avoiding slow-speed maneuvering where German fighters held advantages. When forced into defensive situations, he taught pilots to dive away, using the P-39's excellent dive performance to escape and reset the engagement, rather than attempting to turn with pursuers. These tactics required pilots to think several moves ahead, like chess players considering the consequences of each maneuver. Every climbing turn bled energy that might be needed seconds later. Every dive converted altitude into speed that had to be managed carefully. Pokryshkin's pilots learned to visualize their energy state constantly, making decisions that maintained options rather than committing to irreversible courses of action. The cognitive load was immense, requiring far more mental processing than traditional dogfighting, but the effectiveness was undeniable. Pokryshkin developed a simple rule that his pilots could apply in the heat of combat: altitude equals life, speed equals power, and both together equal victory. This aphorism captured the essence of energy fighting in language that even novice pilots could understand and apply. When in doubt, climb. When attacking, dive. Never sacrifice both altitude and speed simultaneously unless destroying an enemy. These principles, simple in concept but demanding in execution, transformed how Soviet pilots approached air combat. He also taught his pilots to recognize energy traps, situations where apparent opportunities were actually setups for disaster. A German fighter flying low and slow might look like an easy target, but if it had friends with altitude nearby, attacking the low fighter meant sacrificing your own energy state to kill one enemy while becoming vulnerable to his wingmen. Pokryshkin drilled his pilots to always check above and behind before committing to any attack, to mentally calculate whether they had enough energy to complete the attack and escape, and to abort attacks that didn't meet those criteria, no matter how tempting the target appeared. Energy management extended beyond individual maneuvers to mission planning. Pokryshkin calculated how much fuel different mission profiles consumed and planned accordingly. He knew exactly how long his pilots could patrol at various altitudes before needing to return to base. He understood how combat maneuvering increased fuel consumption and factored that into his tactical decisions. This systematic approach to resource management meant that Pokryshkin's pilots rarely found themselves forced to disengage from favorable combat positions due to fuel concerns. Fourth, Pokryshkin emphasized the decisive importance of surprise and positional advantage. German fighter pilots in 1943 possessed more combat experience than their Soviet opponents on average. In equal terms engagements, Luftwaffe skill often prevailed, but Pokryshkin refused to accept equal terms. He positioned his aircraft to attack from the sun, from high altitude, from angles where German pilots' experience couldn't save them because they never knew the attack was coming until shells were already striking their aircraft. This emphasis on surprise required patience that contradicted Soviet Air Force culture. Official doctrine emphasized aggressive offense and relentless attack. Pokryshkin taught his pilots to wait, to maneuver into position before committing, to pass up marginal opportunities in favor of perfect ones. He would circle for 10 or 15 minutes, climbing and positioning before making a single attack run. Other Soviet units criticized this approach as passive, but Pokryshkin's kill-to-loss ratios silenced those critiques. Dead heroes accomplished nothing. Living pilots who destroyed the enemy while preserving their own aircraft could fight again tomorrow. Pokryshkin studied how human vision worked and how pilots scanned the sky for threats. He learned that pilots tended to look ahead and below more than behind and above, creating blind spots that could be exploited. He understood that aircraft silhouettes were harder to see against certain backgrounds, and that attacking from directions where the target aircraft appeared against empty sky rather than ground made detection more difficult. Every tactical detail received this kind of analytical attention. The cumulative effect of these innovations transformed the P-39 from a marginalized aircraft into the Soviet Air Force's most effective fighter. By war's end, Soviet pilots flying Airacobras would claim more kills than those flying any other aircraft type. The top Allied aces of World War II would be Soviet P-39 pilots, including Pokryshkin himself, with 59 confirmed victories, Grigory Rechkalov with 56 and Nikolai Gulayev with 57. These numbers exceeded the scores of famous American and British aces, not because Soviet pilots possessed superior skill in absolute terms, but because they had developed tactics that maximized their aircraft's strengths within the specific combat environment of the Eastern Front. Pokryshkin's influence extended beyond his immediate unit. Soviet Air Force Command distributed his tactical writings throughout fighter regiments on all fronts. Pilots who had never met Pokryshkin learned his methods through training materials that bore his name and incorporated his innovations. The transformation of Soviet fighter effectiveness between 1943 and 1945 owed much to the systematic adoption of tactics that Pokryshkin had pioneered and proven in combat. Regional Air Force commanders, who had initially resisted his innovations, found themselves under pressure from Moscow to implement similar approaches. After statistical analysis showed the dramatic difference in combat effectiveness between units using traditional tactics and those employing Pokryshkin's methods. The widespread adoption of Pokryshkin's tactics created a feedback loop of improvement. As more pilots used his methods, they discovered refinements and variations that worked in specific situations. These insights were shared back through the system, creating a continuously evolving body of tactical knowledge. By 1944, Soviet fighter tactics bore little resemblance to the rigid, formation-focused approaches of 1941. The transformation owed much to Pokryshkin's pioneering work and his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. The P-39's transformation from failure to success raises profound questions about military judgment and technological assessment. Western air forces tested the Airacobra extensively and concluded it was unsuitable for frontline combat. Soviet pilots flew the same aircraft and created legends. How do we reconcile these contradictory outcomes? The simple answer, that Eastern Front combat differed from Western Front conditions, is accurate, but insufficient. It doesn't explain why Western evaluators failed to recognize that their criteria might not be universal, or why they couldn't imagine operational environments where the P-39's characteristics would prove advantageous. Part of the explanation lies in organizational culture and institutional biases. American and British air forces in 1942 and 1943 were developing long-range bomber offensive doctrines that required high-altitude fighter escorts. Their evaluation criteria reflected those doctrinal priorities. When the P-39 failed to meet high-altitude performance standards, evaluators concluded it had failed completely, not that it had failed for their specific operational requirements. The possibility that other air forces might have different requirements, different operational environments, different tactical approaches that could exploit different aircraft characteristics, this possibility never received serious consideration. The assumption that American and British combat conditions represented the universal standard for air warfare revealed a broader failure of imagination. Western air forces operated from the premise that their way of fighting was the correct way, the modern way, the way that emerging technology and tactical theory demanded. Alternative approaches were primitive or outdated, suitable perhaps for less sophisticated militaries, but not for professional forces. This mindset prevented Western commanders from recognizing that the Soviet Union faced genuinely different operational challenges that required genuinely different solutions. Western military culture also emphasized standardization and uniformity to a degree that Soviet forces did not. American and British doctrine sought aircraft that could perform adequately across a wide range of missions and conditions. Specialized aircraft optimized for specific scenarios were viewed with suspicion as logistically inefficient. This preference for versatile generalists over specialized experts shaped how evaluators assessed the P-39. An aircraft that excelled in one narrow role but performed poorly in others was seen as fundamentally flawed, even if that narrow role represented a critical operational requirement. Soviet forces operated under constraints that Western allies barely understood. Their logistics system couldn't support the complex maintenance requirements of temperamental high-performance aircraft. Their training programs couldn't produce pilots with the hundreds of flying hours that American and British pilots received before combat deployment. Their tactical situations involved close support for ground forces rather than strategic bombing campaigns. These constraints shaped Soviet aircraft preferences and tactical development in ways that Western observers dismissed as signs of backwardness, rather than recognizing as rational adaptations to different circumstances. Pokryshkin's innovations succeeded partly because he understood these constraints and worked within them rather than wishing them away. He couldn't magically give his pilots more training hours or better radios or more sophisticated aircraft, but he could develop tactics that multiplied the effectiveness of the resources actually available. His formations worked with the limited radio communications Soviet pilots possessed. His energy tactics compensated for the shorter training times by providing clear decision rules that pilots could learn and apply. His emphasis on the P-39's concentrated armament exploited Soviet pilots' tendency toward aggressive close-range gunnery rather than trying to teach deflection shooting techniques that required extensive training to master. Soviet doctrine also emphasized collective achievement over individual glory in ways that Western air forces did not. While American and British fighter pilots competed for individual scores and recognition, Soviet pilots operated within a system that theoretically valued unit performance over personal achievement. This cultural difference meant that Pokryshkin's emphasis on wingman discipline and mutual support aligned with broader Soviet military values, even as it challenged specific tactical doctrines. His innovations succeeded partly because they reinforced cultural norms, even while violating procedural rules. There's a darker dimension to consider as well. The Soviet Air Force suffered catastrophic losses during the war's early years. Entire pilot generations were destroyed in the first months of German invasion. By 1943, Soviet commanders couldn't afford to be precious about pilot survival the way Western air forces could. Pokryshkin's tactics prioritized mission effectiveness over pilot safety when those priorities conflicted. His emphasis on surprise and position certainly reduced casualties compared to the suicidal frontal attacks that characterized earlier Soviet tactics, but Soviet pilots still flew far more missions with far fewer rest days than their Western counterparts. The P-39's success in Soviet hands was built partly on a foundation of acceptable loss rates that American or British commanders would have found intolerable. Soviet pilots during the Cuban campaign often flew 4 or 5 missions per day, with minimal time for rest between sorties. Aircraft maintenance happened rapidly, sometimes cutting corners that would violate Western safety standards. Pilots flew with injuries that would ground them in American or British squadrons. The entire operational tempo reflected an understanding that aircraft and pilots were resources to be expended in pursuit of victory, not assets to be carefully preserved. Pokryshkin's tactics reduced the rate of expenditure, but they didn't eliminate it. We must also question the mythology that surrounds Soviet victory claims. German records rarely corroborate the specific numbers of aircraft destroyed that Soviet pilots reported. The Soviet confirmation system was less rigorous than Western equivalents, often accepting pilot claims without independent verification from gun camera footage or witness statements. Pokryshkin's 59 victories represent the official count of claims accepted by Soviet authorities, not necessarily the count of German aircraft actually destroyed. Western historians have spent decades trying to reconcile Soviet victory claims with German loss records, generally concluding that actual Soviet kill numbers were substantially lower than claimed figures. This doesn't diminish Pokryshkin's genuine accomplishments. He was unquestionably a skilled pilot who developed innovative tactics that improved Soviet Air Force effectiveness. But the specific numerical scorecard should be understood as serving propaganda purposes within the Soviet system rather than representing objective accounting. The Soviet Union needed heroes to maintain morale during the war's darkest periods. Pokryshkin and other top aces filled that role, and their claim scores were amplified to serve state purposes. The actual tactical insights Pokryshkin developed mattered far more than whether his personal score was 59 or 39 or 29. The comparison with German aces is particularly instructive. Luftwaffe pilots like Erich Hartmann claimed over 300 victories, numbers that dwarf even the most successful Allied pilots. These scores resulted partly from superior German aircraft and pilot training, but primarily from the target-rich environment of the Eastern Front and the fact that German pilots flew until they were killed or wounded, accumulating scores over hundreds of missions. Soviet and Western air forces rotated pilots out of combat after specific mission counts, limiting their exposure and thus their potential victory tallies. The scoring system served different purposes in different military cultures. German scores emphasized individual achievement. Soviet scores balanced individual recognition with collective success. Western scores prioritized verifiable accuracy. What matters most about Pokryshkin and the P-39 story is not the specific numbers, but the broader lesson about adaptation and innovation. Military organizations face constant pressure to standardize, to develop doctrines that work across different units and different commanders. Standardization enables mass production, simplified training, predictable performance. But excessive standardization kills innovation and prevents adaptation to local conditions. The Soviet Air Force, for all its flaws and rigidity, allowed Pokryshkin enough freedom to experiment, to develop new tactics, and to prove their effectiveness through results. That organizational flexibility, emerging paradoxically from a totalitarian system, enabled the P-39's transformation from failure to success. Western air forces missed opportunities by dismissing the P-39 so completely. Even if high-altitude bomber escort wasn't feasible with the Airacobra, ground attack and low-altitude air superiority missions certainly were. The United States produced more than 9,000 P-39s during the war. Most sat unused or served in training roles because operational commanders wouldn't accept them. Imagine if even a fraction of those aircraft had been deployed with tactics optimized for their actual capabilities rather than rejected for failing to meet capabilities they were never designed to possess. The waste was immense, driven by institutional inability to match weapons to appropriate missions. The Pacific Theater particularly represented a missed opportunity for effective P-39 employment. Much of the fighting in the Southwest Pacific occurred at low to medium altitudes, exactly where the P-39 performed well. The aircraft's heavy armament would have been effective against Japanese bombers and light ground targets. Yet American commanders in the Pacific rejected the P-39 just as firmly as those in Europe, missing a chance to employ it in a role where it might have excelled. The P-39 story also illuminates the relationship between industrial production and tactical effectiveness. America's manufacturing capacity allowed it to produce aircraft in quantities that the Soviet Union or Germany could never match. But quantity means nothing without effective employment. The thousands of P-39s that sat idle in American storage facilities represented wasted industrial capacity and lost tactical opportunities. The 5,000 P-39s shipped to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease achieved more combat impact than the remaining 4,000 kept in American service, not because Soviet industry was superior, but because Soviet tactics were better matched to the aircraft's characteristics. This suggests uncomfortable questions about how Western military organizations evaluate effectiveness and allocate resources. The bureaucratic processes that governed American aircraft procurement prioritized meeting specification requirements over achieving operational results. An aircraft that performed poorly against abstract standards but might prove effective in specific combat scenarios received lower priority than an aircraft that checked all the boxes regardless of actual combat utility. This specification-driven approach created perverse incentives where contractors optimized for test performance rather than operational effectiveness. Modern militaries continue to struggle with similar challenges. Advanced weapon systems often fail to meet performance expectations, not because of engineering deficiencies, but because requirements were poorly matched to operational realities. The lesson of the P-39 remains relevant. Context matters, tactical employment matters, and understanding your weapon's actual capabilities matters more than its theoretical specifications. These lessons appear obvious in hindsight, but remain difficult for large bureaucratic organizations to internalize and apply consistently. The morning after that extraordinary day in March 1943, Pokryshkin's aircraft sat on a muddy Soviet airfield, its aluminum skin pocked with rivets and streaked with oil stains. Ground crews swarmed over it, reloading ammunition, refueling tanks, checking systems. Mechanics who had worked on the Airacobra since its arrival in Soviet service handled it with new respect. This wasn't just another American hand-me-down. This was a weapon that had just proven its worth in the crucible of actual combat, and they were part of making it deadly. The maintenance crews understood something profound had shifted. They had heard pilots complain about the P-39's quirks and limitations since the first Lend-Lease aircraft arrived. Now those same pilots spoke about the aircraft with genuine affection and respect. The mechanics took pride in maintaining aircraft that were killing the enemy and bringing their pilots home alive. Morale soared throughout the ground support staff. Pokryshkin himself stood nearby, debriefing with his wingmen and discussing the previous day's engagements. Other pilots from the regiment gathered to listen, asking questions about specific maneuvers, about timing, about how to recognize the perfect moment to attack. The knowledge was spreading. What one man had demonstrated, others could learn. The tactics that had seemed so radical just months earlier were becoming standard procedure. The P-39 was no longer a flying coffin. It was becoming the weapon of choice for Soviet fighter pilots who understood how to use it. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or universal. Resistance to Pokryshkin's methods persisted among older commanders who viewed any deviation from doctrine as dangerous individualism. Some pilots tried to implement his tactics without understanding the underlying principles, leading to disasters when they found themselves in situations their partial knowledge couldn't handle. But the successes were undeniable, and success has a way of overcoming institutional resistance. Within 6 months, variations of Pokryshkin's tactical system were being taught in Soviet flight training schools and implemented across frontline fighter regiments. Junior pilots arriving at frontline units in late 1943 and early 1944 had never known any tactics except Pokryshkin's innovations. To them, the old methods of tight formations and frontal attacks seemed archaic and suicidal. The new generation took Pokryshkin's principles for granted, building on them and developing further refinements. The evolution of Soviet fighter tactics accelerated as more pilots contributed insights and shared experiences. What had begun as one man's innovations became a collective body of knowledge that transformed an entire air force. Across the front lines, German intelligence officers were compiling concerning reports. Luftwaffe pilots were encountering a new type of Soviet fighter tactics, more sophisticated and dangerous than the frontal attacks and disorganized swarms they had grown accustomed to defeating. The new tactics emphasized discipline, coordination, energy management, Western concepts that Soviet pilots supposedly didn't understand. German commanders recognized they were facing not just new tactics, but a fundamental shift in Soviet Air Force capability. The air superiority they had taken for granted since June 1941 was eroding. Some German pilots adapted quickly, developing counter-tactics designed to neutralize Pokryshkin's innovations. They began flying defensive formations with better altitude separation, making it harder for Soviet fighters to achieve surprise attacks. They implemented stricter radio discipline to coordinate responses to Soviet attacks more effectively. But the Germans faced a resource problem that tactics alone couldn't solve. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, against American and British bombers over Germany, against Allied fighters in the Mediterranean, against Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. German pilot training programs couldn't replace losses quickly enough. Experienced pilots who might have countered Pokryshkin's tactics effectively were being killed faster than novices could be trained to replace them. The dynamic shifted further in 1944 as Soviet industry recovered and began producing fighters that matched or exceeded German aircraft in performance. When Pokryshkin's tactics were applied to aircraft like the Yak-9 and La-7, which combined the P-39's firepower with better high-altitude performance. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe, but Pokryshkin continued flying the P-39 throughout the war, demonstrating his belief that tactical skill mattered more than aircraft specifications. He trusted the Airacobra, understood it completely, and saw no reason to transition to a different aircraft when the one he flew worked perfectly for his purposes. His loyalty to the P-39 became legendary among Soviet pilots. When offered newer Soviet-built fighters with superior performance, Pokryshkin declined, explaining that he had developed such intimate familiarity with the Airacobra's characteristics that switching aircraft would actually reduce his effectiveness. This decision illustrated a profound understanding. Mastery of a weapon mattered more than having the theoretically best weapon. A pilot who understood every nuance of a good aircraft would outfight a pilot flying an excellent aircraft without that depth of knowledge. By the war's end in May 1945, the transformation would be complete. The Soviet Air Force that had nearly been destroyed in 1941 had evolved into a formidable fighting force that controlled the skies over Berlin during the final assault on the Nazi capital. Much of that evolution traced back to innovations that Pokryshkin and pilots like him had pioneered during the desperate middle years of the war. The P-39 Airacobra, rejected and dismissed by its original designer's military, had found its true home in the hands of pilots who saw not what it couldn't do, but what it could. There's a photograph of Pokryshkin taken in late 1943, after he had been awarded his first Hero of the Soviet Union medal. He stands beside his P-39, hand resting on the aircraft's nose, expression serious and focused. The aircraft behind him is covered with victory stars, each one representing a confirmed kill. But what makes the image powerful isn't the scorecard. It's the relationship visible between pilot and machine, the sense that both have been tested to their limits and proven themselves. The P-39 in that photograph isn't beautiful. Its proportions remain awkward, its design unconventional, but it looks dangerous and capable, exactly what it was in the right hands. American pilots who flew the Airacobra in training and rejected it for combat never saw it the way Pokryshkin did. They couldn't imagine the tactics he developed or the operational environment where those tactics would prove decisive. Their failure of imagination cost them access to a weapon that, deployed correctly, could have been effective in specific combat roles. The irony is profound. America built the aircraft, but Soviet pilots understood it better than its designers. The deeper truth that emerges from this story transcends aircraft specifications and tactical details. It speaks to the relationship between humans and their tools, between doctrine and reality, between assumption and verification. Western air forces assumed the P-39 was inadequate because it failed tests designed around their preconceptions about what air combat should look like. Soviet pilots discovered it was effective because they focused on what air combat actually looked like in their specific circumstances. One approach was theoretical, the other empirical. One began with doctrinal requirements and rejected anything that didn't fit. The other began with operational realities and adapted tools to match. Modern military organizations still struggle with this same tension. Procurement systems demand clear specifications and objective performance metrics, but warfare remains stubbornly contextual, its effectiveness determined more by adaptation and creativity than by checking boxes on requirements documents. The weapons that succeed are often those that find the right user, the right tactical employment, the right operational environment, not those that score highest on standardized tests. Pokryshkin understood this intuitively. His mechanical background taught him that aircraft were tools, not talismans. They had no inherent good or evil, no destiny to fulfill. They had characteristics, capabilities, and limitations. Success came from understanding those attributes completely and employing the aircraft in ways that maximized advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities. This engineering perspective, combined with tactical creativity and combat experience, let him transform an aircraft that everyone else had abandoned into a war-winning weapon. He retired from the Soviet Air Force as a Marshal of Aviation, having survived the entire war despite flying hundreds of combat missions. In the post-war years, he wrote extensively about his tactical innovations, trying to preserve the lessons that had been learned at such terrible cost. His books and articles became required reading in Soviet military academies, influencing generations of fighter pilots who never flew combat themselves but absorbed his principles. But like many combat innovations, His insights were partly forgotten during peacetime, rediscovered only when the next generation faced similar challenges. The cycle continues. Doctrine calcifies, reality intrudes, innovative practitioners adapt, organizations slowly learn, and then the process begins again. The P-39 Airacobra left Soviet service shortly after the war ended. The Soviet Union had no further use for Lend-Lease aircraft, once domestic production could meet requirements. Most were scrapped or abandoned at remote airfields where they slowly deteriorated. A few survive in museums, including Pokryshkin's personal aircraft, preserved as a monument to his achievements. Visitors who see it today, unaware of its history, might wonder why such an ungainly machine merits preservation. Those who know the story understand that they're looking at evidence of a profound truth. The weapon matters less than the warrior who wields it. In the span of 24 hours on a March day in 1943, Aleksandr Pokryshkin destroyed 6 German aircraft and validated a tactical system that would transform Soviet fighter operations for the remainder of the war. He proved that the P-39 wasn't a flying coffin, but a precision instrument that demanded skilled hands and intelligent employment. He demonstrated that assumptions about weapons' effectiveness must always be tested against operational reality rather than accepted on institutional authority. And he showed that innovation emerges not from perfect tools, but from practitioners willing to understand the tools they have and discover what those tools can actually accomplish. The Airacobra's story reminds us that failure and success are rarely absolute conditions. They are contextual judgments that depend on criteria, circumstances, and the humans who must translate potential into performance. An aircraft that fails in one environment with one set of tactics can dominate in another environment with different approaches. The distance between failure and triumph is often measured not in technical specifications, but in imagination, adaptation, and the willingness to question what everyone knows to be true. Pokryshkin bridged that distance, and in doing so he changed not just the outcome of air battles, but our understanding of what is possible when human creativity meets mechanical capability in the crucible of war. His legacy extends beyond the specific victories or the tactical innovations. Pokryshkin represented a type that appears in every military conflict, the thinking warrior, who refuses to accept conventional wisdom without testing it, who sees possibilities where others see limitations, who understands that winning requires not just courage or aggression, but analysis and adaptation. These figures rarely fit comfortably within military hierarchies. They question too much, experiment too readily, challenge established practices too frequently. But they win, and their winning forces institutions to reconsider assumptions that might otherwise persist unchallenged for decades. The P-39's redemption story offers hope for anyone who has been dismissed, written off, or declared a failure by authorities who never truly understood what was being evaluated. Sometimes the judgment is correct, and the thing really is inadequate. But sometimes the judgment reflects the limitations of the judges rather than the limitations of the judged. Pokryshkin proved that a weapon condemned as worthless by 2 major air forces could become the preferred tool of the war's most successful fighter pilots. He didn't change the weapon. He changed how it was understood, how it was employed, and what success looked like when using it. That transformation stands as testament to human ingenuity's power to overcome institutional inertia and rewrite narratives that everyone believed were already finished. The aircraft that Western pilots called a flying coffin became in Pokryshkin's hands an instrument of precise and deadly effectiveness. The same aluminum and steel, the same engine and guns, the same awkward proportions, but completely different outcomes because one pilot refused to accept that the story was already written. He saw potential where others saw only failure, and he possessed the skill, determination, and tactical genius to transform that potential into reality. In 24 hours, he changed the P-39's reputation forever, and in doing so, he reminded us that human ingenuity and tactical brilliance can overcome any technological limitation. The lessons of that March day in 1943 echo still, speaking to anyone who has ever been told that something cannot be done, that a tool is inadequate, that failure is inevitable. Pokryshkin's answer was simple but profound. Context matters, understanding matters, and the warrior who truly masters his weapon can accomplish what the experts declare impossible.